This PD presentation will show you how to incorporate student-generated questions into daily instruction. The rationale behind this is Google's 20% time, which is also known as innovation time off. The innovation time off allowed employees at Google to use 20% of their workday actually working on ideas or projects that interest them, and these projects were not allowed to be job-related. The reason for this is that it allowed innovative ideas and projects to flourish without fail in issues dealing with politics or budgets. Some ideas created due to Google's 20% time were Gmail, AdSense, Google News, and Google Teacher Academy. So something that I found was that some of the best ideas came from Google's 20% time because the Google employees were allowed this innovation time. So I felt that it was important to implement that in the classroom as well. So 20% time in the classroom is really just taking the time to provide students time to explore their own interests. The way that this looks is students generate a question based on their interests. Students use multiple resources to gather information. Students use resources along with their own knowledge to answer their questions. Students consider an audience to share their information and choose an appropriate means to share. Students reflect about the process of their learning along the way, and students use teacher and peer feedback regularly along the way. The theory that really supports Google 20% time is the unfoldment theory. The unfoldment theory states that learning was most facilitated through a natural unfolding of the mind based on individual curiosity and interests. So educators should follow students' leads because otherwise students won't be interested. Another quote that goes along with this is that children's learning will evolve naturally with curiosity. So allowing students this 20% time will allow students to be more curious about different learning things. Manipulatives are also a big important part of the unfoldment theory because they're supposed to enrich the environment. So providing students with resources is extremely important to Google 20% time. Another theory underneath the unfoldment umbrella is the inquiry learning theory. And the inquiry learning theory really follows the steps that are used in 20% time in the classroom. 20% time really is problem-based, where students have to identify a problem, write a hypothesis or question, and collect data in order to answer that question. From that data that they collect, they're required to draw conclusions or answer that question, and then reflect on any problems along the way. Now, along the left-hand side, I have written the steps of the 20% time in the classroom. And one of the biggest problems teachers have with 20% time in the classroom is the time. Why should they take the time out of instruction to allow students freedom to explore what they want? Well, I've compared this with literacy so you can see how the 20% time really goes along with literacy and different things that you would cover anyway. So one of the steps in 20% time is brainstorming interests, which in literacy is similar to having students access their background knowledge in their schema. Once they have accessed their background knowledge and schema, they can select a passion. And once they've selected a passion, this is when the questioning comes in. And questioning, as you know, is a big part of this. So coming up with lower level and higher level thinking questions in Bloom's taxonomy can be applied specifically in reading with the questioning strategy or the inferring strategy. Planning is another important component to the 20% time, and I found that this really connects with sequencing events and summarizing. Researching is another huge component, and researching allows students to use a variety of the reading comprehension strategies, but most of all, the focus is use of nonfiction features, like on websites or in textbooks, whatever they're using in order to gather their information. Interviewing and organizing, I'm going to go back to reflecting in just a second. Interviewing and organizing goes along with inferring answers to higher level questions and synthesizing information from various sources. And then as I've mentioned before, students are reflecting along the way during 20% time. And when they're reflecting along the way, that really goes along with metacognition and having students thinking about their thinking. Toward the end of the 20% time project, students are creating things, and use of technology, I know, is just something that many teachers try to incorporate in their daily instruction. Presenting and sharing is the last step to the 20% time. And when students are presenting and sharing, they're really practicing language and speaking skills. Another theory that supports or that is used when doing Google 20% time is behaviorism, specifically the direct instruction component. Direct instruction is where teachers explicitly explain a set of skills and identify objectives. They share examples, they sequence and model steps, and provide practice, review, and feedback. So I used mini lessons a lot when first starting 20% time. And these mini lessons scaffold types of skills which students can apply to their own research project. So for example, I had a simultaneous project along with them, and I showed the struggles that I had and the steps that I did to complete the different steps along the way. And then because of those mini lessons, the students used those skills that I modeled and applied that to their own research project. So the first step to the process is brainstorming interests. So this is where you're getting the students to think about what they're interested in learning. This activity will allow students to brainstorm their interests. Another theory that supports the Google 20% time is the schema theory. The schema theory is where people organize everything they know into a schemata or knowledge structures. So the allot some little activity is one way that students can access their schema and use that to select their question. So this is kind of the step before the question. The way the allot some little activity works is that after the brainstorming step, they would have selected a topic that they want to focus on. On the allot column, they'll write different categories within that topic that they know a lot about. Then in the sum, what they know some about, and in the a little, what they know a little bit about. And then once they've identified these different categories, that will help them focus on what they want to ask a question about. And then the questioning process is one of the most important steps in this whole 20% time. But students don't know how to write questions right off the bat. So learning about different types of questions and having them write higher level thinking questions themselves was really important. So these two activities, the inch, foot, and yard activity, as well as the Bloom's Taxonomy higher level thinking question activity, will be something that we'll talk about and something that you can implement in your classroom. Once students have written a question, the next step is the planning step. And this was really challenging for a lot of students because they have a hard time sequencing these events and picturing how they're going to actually research and find the answer to their question. So I did the direct instruction by modeling different types of steps that might go into a research plan. So these different types of steps may include listing things, the steps that about their research and search terms that they might type, steps about interviewing and how to write interview questions and things like that, the organizing steps, so how are they going to actually take their research and put it all together to synthesize the answer, and then the steps involving creating. I found that getting students a good plan at the beginning is really important later through the process because they can use their plan as a checklist. And once they use their plan as a checklist, it really allows them to be more independent. The next step to the process is the researching and interviewing process. So I had to do a variety of different modeling activities where students practice a variety of skills during researching. So some of the activities that you might incorporate are using appropriate search terms, selecting reliable websites, using text features, accessing text-to-voice technology to support struggling readers, writing interview questions, and finding appropriate interviewees. The next step to the process that's kind of incorporated at each step along the way is reflection, but we'll talk about reflection now. Reflection is really challenging for students right away because they're not used to being as metacognitive about their learning. So I found that it's really important to provide students with prompts. And the prompts would be like questions that would help them think about what was challenging for them, what was easy for them, and what they're doing next. But prompts still weren't enough for my students, so I provided my students with examples of my own reflections throughout the process so they could learn what language to use. And then once they actually did reflect, I provided a lot of feedback to students because it's important to push them and have them share more about the process because, again, this isn't something that's natural to them. The last step, or one of the last steps of the process, is the organization step. This is really where the students are synthesizing the information. And I work with fourth graders, and organizing the information is really challenging for them. So providing the students with graphic organizers or tips for organization, like I told them to use charts and color coding to identify that important information that they need to identify the answer to the question, that was really helpful. So provide students with graphic organizers or different tips for organization when coming to this step. A lot of modeling can be incorporated here. The creating step. This is where, this is the step where students are creating something to share the answer to their question. So this is really going to look different for each project because it should be something that is a meaningful way to share their information, and they should be keeping the audience in mind. Now, I decided to relate the 20% time to Common Core because I'm not going to read through each of the different standards that this correlates with, but as you can see, students are doing many of these different things relating to Common Core, and this is just a great way to implement Common Core in your classroom. Now, since each project is different, not each standard is addressed for each student per project, just because each of these projects are different, but definitely some of these standards are covered per project. So although I really am a huge fan of 20% time, there are some pros and cons that you have to consider before deciding whether or not you want to implement this in your classroom. Some of the pros are that students are given the freedom to explore their own interests. This process really naturally lends itself to embracing cultural and linguistic diversity because students are choosing what they want to research and the means in which they want to research, so they can choose appropriate topic or appropriate websites at their level or appropriate books at their level, or if they want to address the cultural things that interest them, they might share a little bit more about their culture through these projects. So this really allows for a lot of differentiation. Students also apply various skills in an authentic and meaningful way. This really promotes creativity, and it's engaging for students, and feedback is provided regularly, so that really helps students out. Some of the cons include that students haven't completely developed these skills to do the projects independently. So you'll need to provide students with a lot of feedback in order to make these projects successful. Finding time is also a challenge because there are demands in the curriculum. Management of multiple projects is also very challenging. I'll show you one way that I've done this that made the management a little bit easier. The lack of correlation with the curriculum, kind of like I mentioned before, is a challenge, so you'll really need a lot of support from your district if this is something that you want to implement. And the fact that there's no assessment. Now, kind of like in the 20% time for Google, they didn't want failure to be a component of this. They wanted it to be a process. So with 20% time, assessment really isn't a component. Some more pros are that students learn how to problem solve. Students are reflective of their learning, and students learn from each other. And the most meaningful thing that I get from this is that students are learning how to learn. Some more cons include finding time for students with IEPs to be included. I know that was one of the challenges that I've had, and students with IEPs have a certain demand for minutes that need to be met. And really, to implement 20% time well, you need 90-minute blocks for students to work, and that just doesn't logistically work with students with IEPs at times. So just some logistical issues. Another con is that resources may not be available. My school has a lot of technology, and we're very fortunate about that, but we are not one-to-one, and it's just going to be a challenge when all teachers want to start implementing 20% time, and the resources may not be available all the time. And also, since this is new, many students have a hard time adjusting to this type of learning. So here are some other resources that you might use if you're interested in implementing this 20% time in the classroom. And just to wrap up, I'll show you the PSI website that I did, and PSI is just what we call it. This is how I implemented 20% time in the classroom. And it's loading. Here we go. So I found it really important to keep everything in one place because, like I said, the management can be overwhelming. So on the front page, I just had the class questions because this allowed parents to look at the questions, and maybe they might give students suggestions of people to interview or things like that, or just resources that they might use. And this is just a good way for other students to see what other people were researching, and they might ask for help through this homepage. I've also have a mini lessons, product how-tos, student feedback, and templates page. On the mini lessons page, this is where I documented all of the direct instruction that was provided for our students, and this was just helpful if students were having a hard time with a certain step. This was just one way that they could address these problems individually rather than raising a hand and asking a teacher right away. The product how-tos page, this is mainly for the creating step of the whole process, and these were just a variety of instructions on different technology tools that students could use. And again, this is a way that students aren't just asking a teacher for help on how to use a different tool. Instead, they're using the resources that they have available and independently figuring out how to do it. The student feedback page, this was just something that I used to kind of see what students were thinking about the whole process, and it was a great way to see what I'm going to change next time I implement it. And then the templates page, this is just more of a resource for me. Now on here, as you can see, I have all of the students' names along the side. And for each student, they have their own set of subpages. So one page is the audience page, and this gets students to think about how they're going to share their information with their audience and what means they're going to use to do that. There's the documentation page, and this is where students take their notes and have their information and organization on there. The reflections page is something students accessed each day, and it just talked about different challenges they faced or different successes they have. And then the resources page is another spot that students had to use, and this was just a way that students were making sure that they were giving that they were citing their sources, basically. And then again, like I told you, I kind of simultaneously did a project alongside them. So this is where I kept that so students could refer back to that. Also, this is just one spot where all of the projects are hosted. So the final projects and questions that students have are documented on here, and there's something that they can look back on the next time they do PSI, and hopefully that will help them with their project. So good luck implementing good luck implementing 20% time in your classroom, and I hope that you enjoyed this PD presentation.